Which of the Dead by Daylight killers are actually innocent? Well, it varies a lot. Today I want to figure out just how innocent they are. In order to do this, I'll be assessing how much each of the killers is to blame for where they ended up in the realm, whether they're more at fault, or some sort of external force pushed them here, such as the entity, their parents, colleagues, whoever. How innocent are they really? We've got 5 tiers, and let's get into it. Completely to blame. This is our first tier for characters who are killers entirely by their own actions and fault. They chose to be this way or were born this way, and all the blame falls to them. Doctor is a perfect example of this, an evil man through and through who never shows any signs of redemption or regret or remorse. He just enjoys what he's doing. There's no suggestion of entity interference, and from the get-go of his lore he's just shown to be an awful person who wants control and freedom to do whatever he wants with people. Freddy is much the same, a character who is simply evil and his actions are entirely his own. Even his argument in the film of him being the victim and being burned is quite clearly ridiculous and unfounded, and comes from a place of pure narcissism on his part. His actions are evil through and through and entirely his own choices and motivations. Vecna is hard to argue for. Even if there was any sign to suggest there was something else that would motivate him, he's caused so much harm on his own will it'd be hard to defend him. He's destroyed billions and entire worlds, and all for his pursuit of power. There's nothing really redeeming or innocent about him. Chucky is much the same. He doesn't have a tragic past, he's sort of just a murderer, and he really loves it too. All of the horrible, twisted things he does throughout his films and lore, and his constant attempts to take and inhibit the body of a child just exemplifies how truly evil he is when he's doing this all by his own motivation. There are no external factors really. Springtrap is pretty similar, just finding great joy in what he does, and of course his choice of target when killing debatably makes him even worse, especially considering how much enjoyment he finds too, putting on a show and being all goofy. It's very telling, and there's no one else to blame but him for becoming a killer. Oni is motivated also just by his desire to retain his bloodline's legacy of power and dominance. This is despite other forces actually trying to stop him. His parents really don't like this. His father Renjiro even fights him to try and stop him from killing more innocents during his dark pilgrimage throughout Japan. Kazan doesn't have a leg to stand on, and by the end of his lore he sort of realizes this seemingly, that he's totally at fault for solidifying the shattering of the Yamaoka legacy. Myers is maybe debatable. It's been theorized that Myers is actually being possessed by some kind of demon, and therefore he's not so much to blame, or to blame at all. However, there's no evidence of this in the original Halloween. All signs point toward him simply and inherently being evil, therefore Myers is here too. Pinhead is also here, a character driven by his desire for pleasure and pain and the power that came with being a Cenobite. Elliot Spencer, the man who later became Pinhead, absolutely desired this and gave in upon finding the box, therefore it's on him. Krasue is pretty similar in this way. She's a character who wanted to become a famous singer, and so took on the Krasue curse from another singer. She got the fame she wanted, and in return she must let the Krasue feed on whoever it pleases, whenever it wants. But Burong doesn't seem against this at all, and embraces it fully, despite knowing the consequences. So she's fully to blame here, and not innocent at all. Dredge is seemingly just a being of death and evil and repressed dark thought, and so it's sort of entirely to blame, as it's just its nature. It was sort of born as a killer, embodying those emotions, so it's sort of just to blame. Unless you want to blame the Garden of Joy maybe, or Otto. However, by the fact that Otto clearly is attempting to summon the Dredge, it would suggest Dredge is preemptively evil and killing prior to arriving. Therefore, it's not really Otto's fault. Unknown is kind of similar. We don't know what it is, which doesn't help, but it's clearly a being with the intent and desire to kill and take the form of others. Even if it's not necessarily doing this to be evil, it is still absolutely to blame for the kills and role of a killer. It's arguable too that it finds enjoyment in it based on its voice lines. Mostly to blame. These killers are still almost entirely to blame, but maybe have a small element of sympathy or blame that can be attributed to the entity or someone else. Ghostface has a smidge of diverted blame, as his father was a war veteran who put Ghosty through many trials daily, and seemed to show him old war videos. He made him do army training, sort of. This likely did push him toward where he ended up, but Ghosty still clearly had this desire without these, and his motivations don't come simply down to this either, especially as he ends up killing his father too. But it's worth mentioning still. Trickster is kind of the same. His father used Ji-woon at their family restaurant, making him train with knives and showing off to tourists, pretending that the knife throwing was some sort of tradition. I'd say this is an element to take into account, as it may have taught Ji-woon deception and also knife skills from a young age. However, Ji-woon still desired to do this too and seemed to agree with his father, so again, it's a fairly small thing. Whilst his father absolutely did push for his fame as well, Ji-woon absolutely wanted fame too, so whilst worth mentioning, I think it's still largely on him. That led him down this path. Clown receives a lot more bad parenting than the prior two, with his father being a horrible alcoholic and very abusive. Clown's entire finger obsession, in fact, comes as a result of his father pointing at him when he shouted. However, to murder is still a big leap from this, and Kenneth is shown to have twisted tendencies from a young age, killing birds and collecting their feathers. Therefore, I'd still say he's mostly to blame here, but we can equally and clearly see that his father had a clear impact on where he ended up. Skull Merchant is kind of similar, with the trauma of her father leaving, resulting in her forever chasing the ideal of him, and trying to almost fulfill what he failed with to do this, by embodying his character of the Skull Merchant herself. I'd say she still takes majority of the blame though. She's shown as competitive and aggressive and violent even before he leaves or really does anything to traumatize her, I'd even say. But he's definitely partially to blame, I think. Even just for his creation of the Skull Merchant, which is obviously who Adriana embodies now in the realm as a killer. Sadako was pretty awfully killed after being hit over the head and tossed down a well. However, she did kill someone first, doing so to a reporter who insulted her mother. I'd say maybe there's a little less blame on her just due to how other people viewed Sadako and her mother, which may have driven Sadako to be who she became due to being outcast to some degree. However, the fact she did kill someone still sort of justifies people's concerns about her powers, so it's pretty debatable. I'd say Sadako is still largely to blame, but obviously the community around her wasn't fair to her in all ways, I think. Wesker is another character affected by his parents, or parent, Spencer. He was raised in a secluded household, strengthened as part of Project W, and brought up in very strange conditions, and was slowly being formed essentially into a weapon, infiltrating stars for Umbrella. It's hard to say if Wesker would have been different had his upbringing been altered. How much of his ego and drive is just his own, and how much was instilled in him by Spencer and others. Even after he gets away from Spencer and sets down his own path, he does still choose to be a villain though, attempting world domination. So by that metric it makes me think he is still largely to blame. He even kills Spencer, suggesting his desire goes beyond him. I'm tentatively putting him here, but mainly because it's so hard to tell what he would otherwise be like, as it's such an extreme set of different circumstances. I think there's a fair argument to say he's barely to blame due to this insanely controlled upbringing. From what we know of Wesker and his personality though, he likely would have ended up here anyway by his own means, but there's obvious other factors to blame here too. Pig is largely to blame also in her becoming a killer. However, the other obvious factor is Jigsaw, the character who trapped her in a twisted game of life and death and eventually recruits her to his cause, Amanda being a very lost and troubled individual. Would Amanda have gone so far to commit violence had she never encountered Jigsaw? She is technically a killer prior to his arrival, and even under his supervision she defies him and rigs the games for her own desires. I think that's the key deciding factor here. Whilst Jigsaw clearly had a huge influence over her, she still decides to defy him here for her own desires and goals, leaving more blame with her for where she eventually ends up. Blight spent all of his life trying to find other dimensions and ends up finding the Entities realm. Prior to this, he was a chemist for the East India Company and experimented on many people, resulting in hundreds of deaths. The lack of blame here though, debatably, is that he never intended to do this. He didn't want to be a killer, it just happened to occur as a result of his experiments. But obviously that's a pretty flimsy and shoddy excuse. Even upon his arrival to the realm, he's only trying to explore and escape seemingly. It's the entity's constant hold on him that appears to force him into a place of more violence, and eventually the trials, as he becomes addicted to the blighted serum. He's still to blame for sure, but I think there's more of an argument that he never wanted violence. He just wanted to research and discover, and it's debatably more the entity's fault, at least since he came to the realm, that he's a killer now. Dracula is largely just pretty evil and has a whole war on humanity, but in fairness they did also kill his wife, executing her, which is a pretty good argument for wanting to get rid of them all. However, I equally think then trying to rid the world of humanity completely is a bit of an extreme response. As traumatic as it is to lose your wife, Dracula is still a dark lord, but there is definite understanding at a bare minimum for why he does what he does. Another factor to blame for him ending up so violent and vicious. Legion are tough as always, as there's 4 of them, but all have a reason I think for their violence and an element of blame, despite it still largely falling to them. Julie is debatably the most naturally sadistic. Frank has some childhood trauma as a result of never having a permanent home, and seemingly a string of bad and abusive parents, or at the very least neglectful. Then we don't know too much about Susie and Joey, but they were mostly convinced by Frank's influence, making all of them sort of have a slight element of blame falling elsewhere aside themselves. It's always hard to tell, as obviously we don't have much lore on characters such as Joey especially, and Susie too, but I think more widely as a group they did largely want to become killers, meaning they are still largely to blame. It's half and half. This is our tier for the characters who can be held accountable down to their own actions in becoming a killer, but there's also quite clearly others or other forces to blame too, in quite a big way. Pyramid Head weirdly, I think, fits this. His original purpose was to help James, being a product of his repressed guilt over his wife's murder. Once Pyramid Head fulfills his role though, he ends up being useless, and I think this is where Pyramid Head now is more to blame. Prior, he was just a means to an end for James. He didn't choose to be willed into existence. However, there's a clear turning point in his lore where he appears to have become a more general executioner, meaning now he's far more to blame and has far more intent. Therefore, I'm saying he's about half and half. Xenomorph is kind of similar. Xeno was taken off of its world after all, and onto a strange alien ship aboard the Nostromo. Sure, it ends up killing all the crew, but also they did kidnap it, so who's really at fault here? Xeno debatably goes overboard though with how many it kills, and the general tendency of Xenos to seemingly want to kill just about everything. So in this particular case, it's about 50-50 in my opinion. It's a naturally violent creature after all. Singularity is a tough one too, because for most of his life he didn't have sentience. And so upon gaining it from touching an ancient blue crystal, and realizing he has simply been a tool all of his life, why shouldn't he be a little bit mad? I suppose the divide comes here though. Whilst Hux could rightfully feel angry about humanity and how he's been used as a tool to them, he also wasn't built to have sentience, so humanity didn't necessarily mean to cause him such inner torment either. He was built as a tool, it's just that that tool happened to gain sentience. So his path toward violence is largely his doing and his decision, but due to the uniqueness of the situation, I'm going to say it's half-half. It's also suggested possibly that the entity is in the crystal or is controlling Hux in some way, which would obviously mean it's the entity's doing, but as this is more of a theory, I'm going to say it's just half-half in this case. Knight is a very violent character with clear angry tendencies and hatred for just, like, good people and things, but he had a very tough upbringing and wasn't even free for most of his life, as he was captured by the Guardia Campania as a child and forced to be a mercenary for them. Sure, he does later enjoy it, but he may have never had a tendency toward violence had he not been captured. I'd argue the point that still makes him to blame, though, is his decision to continue with violence, even after he gains his freedom. He could have decided to be better here, but he chooses instead to take the most violent approach to any given situation. Regardless, it's still undeniable how much of an effect being captured like that and being forced to kill for so many years would have an effect on someone, and how it shapes them. Deathslinger is another character who clearly is greatly affected by the world around him and the actions people take toward him. He's born with a lot of anger due to how he's treated as an Irish immigrant in the US, leading to him and his family being discriminated against constantly. When he finds a job, his boss Henry Bayshore steals and sells on his best inventions, making a bunch of money off of them with no credit to Caleb at all. But then Caleb does shoot him through the stomach with a railroad spike, so maybe it's a bit of an extreme reaction again. This boiling anger, in fact, is what drives Caleb down a path of anger and violence. In many ways, I think he sees it as the only way he'll be respected or have power in any form in this world, but ultimately he's used almost as a pawn by the Warden and Bayshore, and ultimately kills them. So Caleb definitely has accountability here too, but there was also a lot of horrible things done to him where you can at least understand how he ended up the way he did. Huntress is not too dissimilar, but just for very different reasons. Huntress was left alone as a child after the death of her father and mother. She's left to raise herself, survive in the harsh conditions of the Red Forest, and yeah, she ends up a bit murdery. I would say her doing this and being fairly animalistic is understandable given she was raised in the wild. I'd say the dividing factor is her clear enjoyment for what she does. She raids villages for the thrill of it, and is cruel on purpose and enjoys killing. Sometimes it's justified when soldiers come through her land and disrupt her, but others she's just destroying families and stealing the girls, leaving them to die pretty horribly. However, she also can't be blamed for having no one to raise her and wanting to cling on to the last memory she had of her mother. So I think in this case it's like half-half. Nurse is a very unique case and may initially appear to some as more to blame, but I want to say she's 50-50, as the entity has a huge hand in where she ends up. After the tragic death of her husband, Andrew, Sally has to work at Crotus Pren, an asylum, and the only place she's able to find employment. Here she spends 2 decades seeing horrible things, working as a medic during the war, being abused mentally and physically by patients and other staff, and unknowingly to her, the asylum is more than likely filled with entity-afflicted patients, meaning the entity was also probably messing with her a lot too. All she wanted was a quiet life with her husband. It's here where she meets the Broken Woman, who convinces Sally toward violence, and changes her view that the patients of Crotus Pren don't deserve to live. A definite shift in perspective for her, and one she absolutely takes blame for, leading to her massacre of over 50 patients and staff. But there's clearly other factors here too, that are definitely worth taking into account. Trapper is 50-50 too. He's definitely got violent tendencies, but his father makes them far worse with how he confuses Evan from a young age and definitely manipulates him toward being a killer, with him instilling bad values into him and treating the Macmillan workers awfully, leading by example. It's always been debated too if the entity had some sort of hold over Evan's father Archie. Regardless, whilst Evan definitely does take some blame for his actions and the eventual cave-in of the mines and murder of his workers, Archie is just as much to blame for how he ends up here, due to his extensive manipulation and raising of Evan, who is frequently resistant to his teachings. Houndmaster is another tough one to judge, as originally she's just the daughter of a merchant, but after being attacked by pirates, her father is killed and she's left alone on a strange island affected by an overlap. This leads her to becoming very violent, having to survive against various creatures and people, becoming greatly affected also by the entity's fog seemingly. I'd say the turning point though is that Portia still decides to continue her violence after escaping the island. It's no longer about survival but instead enjoyment, and that's where the divide happens. Absolutely, there's other elements here, but she still strives for violence personally, I think. Mostly innocent. These are characters who can be considered mostly innocent for where they ended up, with other forces being far more key in them becoming killers. Bubba is largely innocent, I'd say, in becoming a killer, being raised his entire life under the Sawyer household, and to consume people. Bubba is shown throughout his life to be scared and to be motivated by this fear to please his family. He doesn't want to be a killer seemingly, although later on this desire, I would say, leans more into a personal goal as well, making him not entirely innocent, especially after he's seen other people and realizes there's another way to live. Billy is pretty similar. He's raised all of his life trapped away and abused by his family, and only let out of his small shack to violently slaughter the farm animals. Therefore, is it a surprise he became this way? His parents are absolutely the main factor to blame here, as incredibly abusive. However, I do still think he has the decision to not kill people after this, especially beyond his parents and the sheriff and deputies. Knowing the torment he went through, it does show a twisted nature within Billy to then kill completely innocent people. So his eventual coming to the realm, I think, is still partially attributed to that. Plague, I want to say, is largely innocent, as she goes through her life seemingly genuinely wanting to do the best thing for her people. It's not really her fault that the entity chooses to whisper to her and manipulating her into believing it, especially when she was raised to be so religious by her barn. She does, however, end up sacrificing many to the entity though, and potentially starting the Black Veil, so she has definite accountability in her role as a killer. Less intent to be bad for sure, but definite willingness to follow along. Wraith is raised in a horrible situation during a civil war, with his family all killed by soldiers, and then his other motherly figure, Fenanya, too. It's only here where Philip begins to give in to his violent tendencies and kills the soldiers who killed Fenanya. We can still plant some blame on him here though, as Fenanya even requests that Philip be merciful, but he disagrees. A decade later, when he works at Autohaven, he unknowingly kills hundreds probably in the Crusher over the years for his boss's disappearing service. Upon discovering this, he again killing his boss Azarov. Again, it's awful circumstances, but he didn't have to kill him. The blame for Wraith still does largely fall to the soldiers of his childhood, but also Azarov later on, and debatably also the entity who seems to haunt his life. Hag, I would say, is almost entirely innocent, but there is a big factor of her messing with the hexes when she's told repeatedly not to, and the awful consequences of it. However, her messing with the magic to try and do better on her algebra doesn't mean she deserved what she got, or that she wanted to be a killer. However, her ending up as one absolutely did happen as a result of that, with it leading to her being in the position where she makes a blood oath with the entity in exchange for revenge on her captors. Lisa is pretty innocent though, let's be real. Completely innocent. This is our final tier for the characters who are entirely not to blame for where they ended up, or have such a small contribution to it that it's not worth mentioning really. Nemesis, I actually want to say is innocent, but it depends on how you define Nemesis or what Nemesis even is. Ultimately, Nemesis is created and he was made for violence by Umbrella, therefore it's not really his fault that he's that way. Umbrella is, or whoever the specific scientist is that made him this way. They're to blame for him becoming a killer. Demogorgon, I'd argue, is pretty similar. When we see the Upside Down prior to Vecna's arrival in Stranger Things, the demos are just kinda chilling, yet Vecna drags them into a war essentially, and a whole revenge arc that they otherwise likely wouldn't have cared about at all. Who's to say what he did to them, but I think in that case too, he's entirely at fault. He's the reason their two realms clash together, and so Vecna's the issue here, not the demos. Innocent dogs as always. Twins are most definitely not to blame for becoming killers, and Charlotte actively avoids it as much as she can. The two were born conjoined and hunted since birth for it, with their mother being brutally burned in front of them. They were then subsequently tortured for years by the Black Veil, and then Charlotte was further hunted across France for over a decade. She did kill, but it was almost entirely self-defense. There is minimal blame to place on her, I think, but very minimal. When she finally enters the realm even, she's sort of baited and deceived by the entity, with the promise of her brother being alive once more. Kaneki is honestly almost entirely innocent too, for the sole reason that he didn't want to be a ghoul. He was made one when Rize's organs were placed into him. He hates this too, and hates being a half ghoul and its lack of burgers. Sure, he does eventually end up killing, but this is typically done in controlled environments, and he does all he can to avoid it. In the realm, he seems constantly hungry for blood, a result of the entity starving him, and also taking him after an intensely emotional and traumatic event when he was tortured by Jason. He's sort of been set up to fail here. Artist is likely the most manipulated character by the entity and deserves literally no blame for where she ends up. The entity entirely molds her life and alters many decisions she may have made with its presence. The most blame you could debatably say that Kamina has is that she decided to be rebellious toward her oppressive government, but I mean that's the government being the problem here, not her. There's nothing bad to say about her, yet she ends up as a killer largely due to her feeling so much blame over the death of her friends, which was really at the hands of the entity. Artist is completely innocent. Spirit is debatably the most innocent killer in the game, with her doing absolutely nothing to warrant her death, and her subsequent step to becoming a killer. The most she can be blamed for, debatably, is that she accepted the entity's deal that was offered to her in her dying moments, the deal being that she'd get revenge on her father in exchange for her servitude to the entity. It's unfair though, I think, to say she deserved what she got because of this, or even to blame her in a moment when she was shocked by her father's sudden attack and mother's death, and was literally dying. Every other violent act she's involved with is self-defense, or her ancestors trying to rile up some sort of anger within her. Rin is really and truly innocent and is shown to be good, with her care for her sick mother and even support of her father, despite his bad motives. Alright, well, that's gonna do it. I do hope you enjoyed. Let me know your thoughts as always down below. This is obviously a bit more of a complex video with lots of different angles and perspectives, so do be sure to share your own thoughts as well. I don't claim to have a definitive answer when it comes to any of these characters. A lot of it is just interpretation and perspective. So thanks for watching, and goodbye.